All right. Hi everyone. Welcome to the solution video for week 6. In this video, we'll try to target all the assignments that were present in week 6 specifically. There are a few assignments related to the hooks that we have learned about until now. Usually, the way I target these assignments, the standard way you should target them if you're trying to solve them without the solution videos is look at the README, try to read what is being asked from you and try to solve the problem from first principles. That is how I'm going to solve the problem today as well. Let's get right into it. What does the README say? The README says React hooks assignments. You will be given a bunch of folders this week, each with some set of assignments for a specific hook. Go to that specific folder. For example, 1 use memo or 2 use callback or 3 use ref, and comment out the assignment component that you're working on. This is a little weird. We'll see what that is and try to solve it. There are no tests, but there will be solution videos. This is that solution video. If I go to 1 use memo, you will see it is a React project in itself. If I go to source/app.jsx, which is the top level file here, you will see assignment 1 is uncommented and everything is commented. When I'm targeting assignment 1 for this hook, I will go here and try to look at the assignment. When I'm done with the assignment, I feel like I have the right solution is when I can go back here, comment this out, uncomment assignment 2, run it, and then solve assignment 2, so on and so forth. The same will be true for all 3 of these assignments. Cool. Let's go with assignment 1. Here it says, in the assignment, your task is to create a component that performs an expensive calculation, finding the factorial based on a user input. Let's ignore the second line for now, which is the actual thing to learn here. Let's solve the first thing to begin with. The assignment, your task is to create a component that performs an expensive operation, which is calculating the factorial. Let's run this project locally. So inside week 6, let me go to 1 use memo and run npm install. Since 1 use memo is a React project on its own, running npm install here will bring all the dependencies. If you look at it, there is a node modules folder created here. And now if I run npm run dev, you will see the project starts and I have an input box here. If I put some value inside here is when I need to calculate the factorial of it here. Now this is a mild algorithmic problem for the people who have not done data structures and algorithms. This might be a little hard. You don't have to worry too much about the DSA logic here, but it's good for you to solve it yourself if you are interested in solving data structures and algorithms. All right. Let's look at the code base. The component looks fairly straightforward. It says the input is a state variable, and this input gets updated anytime the input box changes. So if I put some value here, let's say 2 or 3, this value goes where it goes inside this state variable. Here is where I have to do an expensive operation, which is finding the factorial. What is a factorial? For 1, the factorial is 1. For 2, the factorial is 2 into 1. For 3, the factorial is 3 into 2 into 1. So on and so forth. It's basically the multiplication from that number up to 1. That's what factorial stands for. So how can I calculate that value? I can be like const or let expensive operation equal to 1, expensive value equal to 1, for let I equal to 1, I less than equal to input, I plus plus, expensive value into equal to, or expensive value equal to expensive value into I. And that's it. I have this expensive value, which is now the factorial of the current input. Anytime the input changes, the function re-renders, all of this logic runs again, and you have a new fresh expensive value that gets rendered here. If I try to see what this looks like on the website now, feel free to pause at this point and rake in the code, maybe try to write it yourself. If I make this 1, I see the calculated value is 1. If I make it 2, 2. If I make it 4, 24. If I make it 10, it's such a big value because 10 into 9 into 8 into 7 into 6, it's a big number. So as you make this bigger and bigger, your browser will begin to crash because this becomes a very big number. But try it out for a few numbers, make sure your logic is right. Now comes the most important part of the assignment. It says, use the use memo hook to ensure that the calculation is only recomputed when the input changes, not on every re-render. This might sound mildly counterintuitive because specifically right now for this application, this will only re-render if input changes, because input is the only state value for this specific application. Does that make sense? When will this re-render? Anytime set input is called. There is no other case in which this component ever re-renders, unless this component is, a child component of a parent which has a state value. But we know this is a very simple application. No state values here, only one state value here. So ideally, in this case, you don't really need use memo, because this only re-renders if input has changed, and if input has changed, you do need to recalculate this. But generally also, it's a good practice to wrap this calculation inside a use memo. Since you know this calculation directly depends on the input state variable, wrap it inside a use memo. Make sure it only runs this expensive operation, only runs when input has changed, to make sure if there are other re-renders, what does it say? The expensive calculation only runs when input changes, which is this thing right here, not on every render. In this case, there are no other cases to re-render, but I could in the future add a state variable here, right? Which causes assignment 1 to re-render. And if this state variable is the variable that has changed, this expensive calculation should not happen again because input hasn't changed. And that's the whole use case of use memo. So how do we solve it? I will be like const expensive value equal to use memo. Anytime input changes, recalculate this value and then return it. This was what was expected from the assignment. You wrap this expensive operation inside a use memo, and what will that do? That will ensure only if input changes does this expensive operation run, otherwise it won't run. Let me save this. Let me go back here, and you will see it still works as expected. And if I make the number very big, as you saw, it eventually became infinity, but you get the idea. I have now wrapped the expensive operation inside a use memo. If you want, you can totally confirm this logic only runs when input changes and does not run in any other re-render. You can try putting a state variable here, try updating it every 1 second or something like that, and ensure this expensive operation will only run if set input is called, because that causes input to change. And we have said very explicitly run this logic only when input changes. All right, that was the solution for the first problem. Let me move to the second one. And before I do that, I should probably comment this one and uncomment assignment 2. That is how you'll be able to test assignment 2 locally. All right, let's look at it. This seems like a big one. In this assignment, you will create a component that renders a large list of sentences and includes an input field for filtering these sentences. Basically, if you look at the final thing, there are a bunch of sentences here and an input field that lets you filter these. For example, if I wrote random, only the sentences that have random in them appear now. If I write random my name random, only the sentences which has these 4 words appear here. It just lets you filter your search. The goal is to use memo to optimize the filtering process, ensuring the list only gets recalculated when necessary. Example, when the filter criteria changes. You will learn something new here, specifically how to pass more than one value in the dependency array. What is this assignment trying to teach you? They have clearly said the new thing you're learning here is until now, you've probably, if it was an assignment 1, we've only passed one thing as a dependency to expensive value. But if you look at assignment 2, the final thing that gets rendered here, the final list that appears here, depends on two inputs. Number one, the filter, and number two, this list. If either of these change, the filtering logic, the logic that converts a very big list into a subset list that needs to render here, needs to rerun. So let's look at the code that they've written and try to solve it. First, they've seeded some words, which basically means they've generated a bunch of random words. If you look at this logic, it says generate 1,000 words and put them in all underscore words array. So this is just logic to generate a bunch of these random words, more specifically 1,000 random words. Then if you look at the component, it creates a state variable which is initialized to these 1,000 words. Again, I can pass empty array here, I can pass this thing here, or I can pass a static global variable that I've created here, so that sentences gets at least initialized with all of these 1,000 words. And then let's go from top to bottom. And then the other thing we have defined is a filter variable, which will store what? It will store the current value inside this input box. So very similar to what we did in the last assignment. This is the expensive operation that is running on every render right now. It is not inside a use memo. So every time assignment 2 re-renders, this logic will run. And what is it doing? It is filtering the sentences, making sure the filter is on. If the sentence includes the filter, then we will keep it, else we won't. If you don't understand this, you have not gone through the filtering lecture from week 2 or 3 most probably, where we discussed map, filter, and a bunch of other common array functions. If you have gone through that, hopefully this is straightforward. X.includes is just a function that you can run that returns true if that string includes that substring. For example, let x equal to my name is Harkirath. X.includes Harkirath will return true, but Harkirath11 will return false because this sentence does not have Harkirath111 as a substring. So what do? I find all the filtered sentences and then I render all of them on the screen. Along with that, I have an input box above it, which anytime the value changes, I set this filter variable here. If I'm being honest, I would urge you to write this component yourself at this point. So you can, irrespective of learning the use memo things, at least write something like this. Generate 1,000 sentences and have a random input box here that lets you filter on these sentences. Cool. Once you're done with that, if you've independently written that, is when you should come back to the final solution, which is going to be what? Okay, bhai, this is an expensive operation. We need to wrap this inside a use memo. And we need to rerun this logic when either sentences changes or filter changes. Because if either one of these have changed, it means the final value returned here will also change. This is what was expected. And the thing to learn was, it isn't necessary that you will only have a single input here. Depending on what all is being used inside this function, you should put that here. If I refresh now, to my it still works as expected. And we've been able to reduce the number of time this runs to when either sentences has changed or filter has changed. Again, in this specific problem, there are no other state variables. So anytime a re-render has happened, either sentences has changed or filter has changed, but that is fine. If there was a state variable here, if there were other reasons when this got re-rendered, we have this logic guarded. This logic will only run if either this changes or this. That is what was supposed to be learned from this video. Try to look at this and then again close the assignment and try to do it yourself end to end, by which I mean try to create a fresh project where you write all of this logic yourself and use memo the right way. Third assignment, let's go back to app.jsx. Let's comment this out and uncomment this. You have been given a list of items you shopped from the grocery store. You need to calculate the total amount of money you spent. Sounds pretty straightforward. I have a state variable. I have these values. I need to basically add this, and this in total value. Can you do it? Try to do it yourself. In the end, we are going to do some mathematical computation over this. You can use another function we haven't discussed much until now, which is reduce, that lets you do this in a slightly more easier way. But okay, let's do it the most naive way, which is let total value equal to 0 for let I equal to 0, I less than items dot length, I plus plus, total value plus equal to, or total value equal to total value plus items of I. Cool. I have this. Hopefully it works as expected. Seems like it does not. Oh, items of I dot value. Cool. It says total value 90. Chocolate price 10, chips 20, 30, 40. If you add all of these up, total value is 90. And that is what we render here. It iterates over all the items, renders them individually, and then renders total value, which is what we've calculated here. But again, we know total value depends on items. So it makes sense for us to wrap this inside a use memo. Okay, bhai, anytime items changes is when you should calculate this. You don't need to do it on every render. And that's what the assignment expected from you. Okay, you do calculate total value, but you do it inside a use memo. But again, at this point, I would urge you to read about this thing called the reducer and how that will make this code slightly more cleaner. And you can do all of this in a single line of code basically, but figure that out yourself. Okay, what is a reducer? How does it work in an array? All right. With that, we're done with the 3 assignments. Does it work as expected? Does work as expected. If I add another value here, the final sum here changes. All right. Done with week 6/1 use memo. Let's move to the second one, which is going to be to use callback. Here again, it's a React project in itself. Let me go to the terminal. Let me go back a folder. Let me go to use callback and run npm install. Go to app.jsx and let me uncomment assignment 1 here, which is what I'll be targeting right now. npm run dev to start the project locally. If I go here, I see some things. Let's see what the assignment is. Create a counter component with increment and decrement functions. Pass these functions to a child component which has buttons to perform the increment and decrement actions. The use callback to ensure that these functions are not recreated on every render. All right. If we understand use callback is what use callback is, then this assignment should be straightforward. What does it say? It says there is a count variable at the top. There are 2 functions, handle increment, handle decrement. You render the count here and then you pass both handle increment and handle decrement as props to the center buttons component or counter buttons component, which renders both of them and says, bhai, when the first button is clicked, on increment gets called, which is this function right here. When the second button is clicked, this gets called. How would you solve the assignment? What does it say? Use callback to ensure that the functions are not recreated on every render. First, let's solve it without use callback. What do we want? Person clicks on this, the count goes up. Person clicks on this, count goes down. How can I do it? I can be like set count -1, set count +1. Increment, sorry, I guess the other way around, plus and minus. Increment, decrement. Works as expected. What is the problem? The problem is that bhai, this thing is re-rendering even though the function isn't changing across renders, or even if the function does not change across renders, it will cause the child component to re-render. But when I click on this, you see a box here, you see a buxa here or not? You do, which means these buttons are re-rendering or this component is re-rendering. But is there anything changing in these two? No, the change is only happening here. So these shouldn't re-render. How will we fix this? Number one, we will wrap this inside a memo, not a use memo, but a memo. What is this? We've discussed a few times now. Would urge you to go to the videos from last week or this week, I guess, week 6. And the second thing I have to do is, rather than defining functions like this, I will be like const handle increment equal to use callback. Const equal to use callback. And now that I've wrapped this, these functions are now using use callback. They will not change across re-renders. Even if count changes, handle increment will not change, because I haven't said okay, this depends on count. This doesn't need to depend on count. It is not, well, it is using count here. It will actually need to depend on count. You will have to write code this way, say, for this to actually work. So we will learn two things here. Number one, you might think, okay, this is enough. Okay, bhai, dekho, this has been, wrapped inside a use callback. This has been wrapped inside a use callback. So now this will not re-render again and again because I have used memo here. And what does memo do? Memo says, lets you skip re-rendering a component when its props are unchanged. And making this wrap inside a use callback makes sure this prop and this prop are unchanged across re-renders, because no dependency here, no dependency here. This will only be assigned as a function once, and on all subsequent re-renders, these two functions will remain unchanged, which will make the child component not render or not re-render. But there is a problem here. What that problem is, we'll see very soon. But this is very close to the solution. If I go back here and refresh, you will notice if I click on increment, does not go beyond 1. If I click on decrement, goes to -1. Increment goes to 1. Decrement goes to -1. What is happening here? I am using count. It's not like I'm not using count here, which means count actually needs to be a dependency here. I repeat, if I'm using count here, I need to make count as a dependency, else you will see this fishy business of what's happening here. If you know you're using a state variable inside, you will have to pass it as a dependency. Okay, Harkirat, great. Seems like you've fixed it now. Yes, I have fixed it. But now the problem remains again. If the component re-renders, it will only re-render when count has changed, which means this function will change and this function will change, and then child will re-render again. If I added count as a dependency here only, then handle increment will change on every render because I'm changing count anytime I click on any of these buttons. Of course, if I change the state variable here, then we have made some progress. Okay, chalo, this only depends on count. If a state variable in the parent changes, or if some other state variable here changes, then it is fine. We have made some progress. We have made sure that the child will only re-render if count changes and no other state variable, because that is the dependency here. But there is still some more scope of improvement. If you remember, I told you can write these, you can call these set functions in two ways. Either you can do this, or you can do set count function, which takes the current count as an input and you return whatever current count plus 1 here. This and this do the exact same thing. Here you pass in some value directly, 1, 2, 3, 22, or for example, in this case, count plus 1. Here, the thing that you pass in is an input, and the argument that you get in this input is the current value of count. That is why I've named it current count. You can name it whatever you want, but this gives you the current count value rather than you having to access it from here. I repeat, you can access the current count value like this, or you can directly write a function कि भाई जो भी whatever is the current value I will get here and I can return it. Why is this better than this in this case? This is better because this guy no longer depends on count. So I can remove count as a dependency because this current count comes here from somewhere. I am no longer using this state variable here. This current count is the state variable only, but it automatically comes inside. It no longer needs to be a dependency here. And that is why I was saying I will write the code like this. Now this and this are just different ways of writing the same thing. I can write a function like this, or I can write a full function which returns something. I can also, do something like this, return count -1. Really depends on how you want to write it. Each one of these will do the same thing. The important thing is count is no longer a dependency here. So I can keep this an empty array. Ideally, you should add set count as a dependency here, but don't worry about it. Even this is good enough. And now this is nirvana. This is a good solution. This is what was expected. Okay, bhai, no dependency here, no dependency here. These buttons don't depend on count. Only this component does. So this thing should not re-render anytime count changes. And we have been able to achieve that. But we were only able to achieve that by using use callback here. If I remove all the use callback here and write a native function, it will cause this to re-render irrespective of these functions still sort of being the same. All right, refresh, increment. Oh. As you can see, no longer does the child component re-render. I don't see a box here, only the parent is re-rendering. Cool. That is what the benefit of using use callback is. You're able to minimize the number of re-renders. Assignment 2. Let's go back to app.jsx. Let's comment this, uncomment this. Looks like some show alert. Let's see what the assignment is. Create a component with the text input field and a button. The goal is to display an alert with the text entered when the button is clicked. Use callback to memorize the event handler function that triggers the alert, ensuring it's not recreated in every render. Currently, we only have input value as a state variable, and hence you might not need same thing. Might not see the benefits. We're also not passing it down to another component as a prop. That's another reason for you to not see a benefit here. So throughout these assignments, I've just kept it very lean, kept only a single state variable. So you might feel like, Harkira, the re-render has happened, this thing has changed, use memo will re-trigger here, or use callback will still change here. Yes, but if this component is being used in a bigger React application, is when you will see the actual benefits of wrapping this inside a use callback. Cool. What was the assignment? I need to first thing alert whatever is put in the input text box. So this is the ugly solution of the assignment, where you have all the features, but they're not as optimal. This is not very performant. If I refresh, alert, it says ASD. If I write hello world here, I see hello world. Now, what should I ideally do? I should show it equal to use callback. What will be the dependency here? The input text. Anytime the input text has changed, this function signature is going to change, which is why this is going to be dependency. Generally true for use memo, use callback. If you're using a state variable inside, make sure you're adding it as a dependency here. Refresh, works functionally, and you have solved the thing that the assignment wanted you to solve. Do you see any benefits yet? No, and that is exactly what's written here as well. Currently, you will not see any benefits, but if you use this in a bigger application, if you have more state variables here, then you will see the real use cases of this, or the real benefits of using a use callback here. That's assignment 1 and assignment 2 for use callback. Lastly, we have 2 assignments for use ref. So let's go back to 3 use ref. Let's run npm install, npm run dev, and let's try to look at this assignment 1 here. What does it say? Create a component with a text input field and a button. When the component mounts or the button is clicked, automatically focus the text input field using useref. Lot of things happening here. What does focus mean? It means cursor should reach here. I want anytime I click here, cursor should reach here. Let's see how you would do this without React. The way to do this without React would be you give this an ID, whatever input box, and then you can simply be like, so here you need to know a little more DOM APIs. Okay, bhai, if you do document dot get element by ID input box dot focus, I think it focuses now. Focus on input box. Focus hi to hai. I think this only works if I don't run this inside the console. Let me copy this and let me paste it in the handle button click function. Let's do this without useref. What am I doing? Simple. If the button is clicked, document.get element by ID input box, which is this element, dot focus, which I'm hoping moves the focus here. See if that works. Focus input, it happened. Let me click outside. Focus input, it happened. Harkirat, why was it not happening when you were doing the same thing in the console? Because if your cursor is here, right? If you're not currently on the screen, if your screen is not in focus, you can't put the cursor in focus. So when I press enter here, unfortunately my current focus is on this developer toolbar. It's not on the website, which is why running this code is not able to focus on this input box. But if I run the same thing here, which is the thing that I just did, then it works as expected. Okay, by clicking on this, focus is here. And what was the other thing that was said? When the component mounts, which means the first time the component renders. How do you know if this is the first time a component has rendered? Here, if you have no dependency in a use effect, means this is going to run when the component mounts. So I can put the same logic here basically. Refresh, and as you can see, by default the focus is here. This is one very common beneficial thing you will see in a bunch of websites. You reach the website and the thing is already in focus. Great. What is the problem? Syntax is slightly ugly. We know React gives us access to useref. It lets you create references to DOM elements. So why not use that? Rather than ID, do a ref equal to input ref, and the top maybe define const input ref equal to use ref. Const input ref equal to use ref, and rather than doing this, I will do what? Input ref dot current dot focus, and same thing over here. All right. This might not be enough, but we'll see very soon. All right, let's see. If I refresh, it is focused. If I click on this, if I click outside, then click on it, focus happens again. Click outside, click on it, focus happens again. That's what was expected from this assignment. What I was thinking was I might need to put input ref as a dependency here. Probably a good idea to do, even though it works without it. I would still probably put input ref here as a dependency. All right. Cool, great start. Why have you not wrapped this inside a use callback? You can, if you want, feel free to. Yeah, as I've said, all of these are not needed, but good performance enhancements. All right, we're done with input ref or the first assignment here. Let's move on to the second assignment. Create a component that tracks and displays the number of times it has been rendered. Use ref to create a variable that processes cross renders without causing additional renders when it changes. Yeah, so this is where you will see another use case of useref. Until now, we have seen a single use case of useref, which is something I discussed in the 6.3 video as well. At the very end, if you go, I said there are two cases in which useref is useful. The first case is this, getting access to DOM elements. The second case is when you want to have access to, this is very hard to explain. It requires a video on its own, but let me try my best here. When you want to have access to a variable across renders, which is not a state variable. This is a state variable. We know state variables. We know we can access them across re-renders. We know when we call this, the state variable updates. If you don't understand this syntax, by the way, you can put a random variable here, whatever, render one or whatever. Basically, if you don't need the first value, you can just leave it empty and add comma here. Let's say you had to solve this assignment. So forget what useref does. Let's say I ask you to solve this assignment. Okay, bhai, create a component that tracks and displays the number of times it has been rendered. Use useref without any other knowledge. How would you do it? How would you log the number of times this component has been re-rendered? If you look at this component, what is it doing? It has a handle re-render function which runs when I click on a button, and that causes force render to call. This is basically updating a state variable randomly, forcing the component to re-render. I can also, if you want, you can make this fancy. You can, count, comma, set count equal to 0, and then this, this does a set count of count plus 1. This is fine as well. The goal is to forcefully re-render the component so that if I go here, if I click on this, the component does re-render. We know that. Okay, haan bhai, state variable is changing, so component is re-rendering. Now I ask you, okay, yahan pe you have to put this component has rendered X times. How would you solve it? Solution number 1. Harkiyat, I will create a state variable. I will be like const number of times re-rendered, comma set number of times re-rendered equal to use state 0 Harkirat. And then Harkirat, I know okay, anytime set count is called, it has re-rendered. So let me call set number of this thing plus 1 Harkirat. This is one solution, Harkirat. What is the problem here? The problem is that this triggers a re-render, and that is what you were supposed to track. Okay, haan bhai, one re-render happened, and then you triggered another re-render to do it. Do you get my point? How many re-renders have happened then? 2. This happened by default. This you added. So 2 have happened. How many have you tracked? You will track only 1. Because you were like, bhai, theek hai, yahan pe control reached. Means a re-render has happened. Let me store that here. Which unfortunately triggered another re-render. So ideally 2 re-renders have happened, but you have only stored 1 here. So there is a discrepancy. This is not the right solution. Basically, if you want to track something like this, using a state variable is the worst way. Because, setting the state variable will re-render, and then, you have extra re-renders which you don't need. How can you solve this a different way? Another solution can be, Harkirat, I will use a global variable. Let number of times let it equal to 0. And then here, I know that by any time a re-render happens, function gets called, I can do this. This is the second solution. This can still be a mildly elegant solution. Yeah, this works. And I can write component has rendered this many times. Refresh. It says rendered 2 times. Makes sense because, as I've said many times, if you use React in strict mode, which you can check in main.jsx here, it does render twice. But if you remove it, it will just render once initially, which is the idle thing. There you go. Component has rendered once. If you re-render, this count goes up. This is great. You were able to somehow solve the problem by creating a global variable. What is the problem in this? There's no real, there is a problem. You should never use, the biggest thing is you should never use global variables. You should never have anything outside any variable like these outside the React life cycle, or outside the React component cycle. Then Harkirat, I can do this. Unfortunately, you cannot do this because anytime the component re-renders now, this gets re-initialized to 0 and then becomes 1. So this solution will not work. If I refresh, it will be stuck at 1 because anytime it re-renders, this becomes 0 again. So Kirat, okay, this was a solution, but you're saying it's not an elegant solution. I know I cannot use useState because that causes an extra re-render. And this though does not work only. So you showed me 3 solutions. 2 of them don't work. And this one you're saying is not elegant. So how can I solve this problem, Harkirat? Great question. Glad you asked. Thought you would never ask. Here is where I'm going to introduce another use case of useRef. I'm going to say, bhai, const number of times re-rendered equal to useRef 0. Okay, bhai, you now store a value, and anytime the component re-renders, I can be like number of times rendered dot current equal to number of times rendered dot current plus 1. Wow, Harkirat, so much code you have written without explaining it. And what is happening here, Harkirat? Firstly, what is happening here even? You to said that useRef is used. Whenever you're using useRef, you do something like this, ref equal to something. And then the reference of this button reaches this guy right here. Yes, that is one use case of ref or useRef. That is exactly what we did here in assignment 1. And this is great. We said const input ref equal to useRef, no initial value. Then eventually we said ref equal to input ref, and then here I had access to dot current dot focus. What is dot current here? It basically represents the current value in this reference, and since this is a DOM element, I did a dot focus to actually focus on it. Here I said why references or useRef is not just used to store DOM elements. You can also use it to store numbers. You can also use it to store integers or strings or whatever you want. That's exactly what I did here. Okay, rather than having this as a global variable, I defined this as a reference to 0, which this reference does not change across re-renders. I can change its value, but the reference remains the same. Why is this good? This is good because this is now part of the React lifecycle. I can pass it to child components, do a bunch of things with it. It's no longer, weird global variable defined at the top. And it also does work as expected. I can, in every render just increase its value without overriding it. If I did this, we saw that this got overridden every time assignment to re-rendered. But if you wrap it inside a useRef, React knows that bhai, okay, anytime this component mounts is when this gets initialized by 0. And in any future re-render, it will not re-initialize it to 0. It will just remember its current value, just like count's value does not get overridden every time you re-render. This guy's value also won't get overridden. And dot current equal to dot current plus 1 is just increasing it by 1 by 1. And if I write dot current here as well, this value basically is persisted across re-render. It's not getting overridden. And I'm increasing it by 1 in every re-render, which is exactly what the problem statement was. If I refresh 1 times, let's see, useRef 0. Oh, I added this. Let me remove that. You don't need this. You never, if you're storing a number here, you don't need this. You don't want to, you do one of the 2 things. You either put a button reference in this useRef or you put a number. You don't do both. Okay, this was just me trying to show. Now if I refresh 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, it works as expected. It's not getting overridden. It is part of the React lifecycle. It's not a global variable defined outside. This is the second use case of useRef. Okay, you don't use it only for storing DOM elements. You can also use it for storing numbers. This probably is going to be the most difficult thing to digest in these assignments, because one, we had not seen this use case before of refs. We thought it is only used when you're binding to DOM elements, but it is also used in this case where you need a variable which cannot be a global variable and cannot be a state variable. In this case, why could it not be a state variable? Because then if I would try to set it, it would re-render and just take away the whole point of the assignment, which was to count the natural number of re-renders of assignment 2, not the ones that, this guy re-triggers as well, or vice versa. If this guy re-renders, if I define this as a state variable and that causes a re-render, we need to keep track of that as well. So we wanted it to be outside this whole life cycle of re-rendering, which is why I created a ref which sort of, what can you think of it? You can think of it as, it has this value here out somewhere out of the component, and irrespective of how many times the component re-renders, it can increase that value independently without, affecting it or overriding it. Cool. That's the high level of what this assignment one taught you something new and also expected you to solve. All right. That's it for this one. Those were all the assignments. Hopefully these were easy. Maybe this one wasn't, but hopefully the rest were easy. Practice some more, write these yourself. Let me push the solutions, but I would still urge you to do all of these yourselves as well. So let me create a folder 1, and then another folder 2, and then another folder 3, and then copy all these 3 into 1, and then let me copy all these 3 into 2. And this into 3. So feel free to look at the solutions if you feel like it. I'll push these onto GitHub, but would urge you to try these yourselves. That's it. Thank you everyone for joining. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.